Welcome everyone to the Sierra Club Community Conversations. We started this a couple weeks ago. First, we started it with a discussion on the Vermont Green New Deal with Senator Anthony Polina and Jael Polskamp with 350 Vermont. Then last week, we did a conversation with Sarah Copeland-Hanzas, Representative Sarah Copeland-Hanzas, to talk about the climate solutions priorities. We're going to welcome TCI with Commissioner Peter Walk, but then he'll be followed shortly after by Mark Kresowick. So Commissioner Peter Walk, please take it away.
Sure. Good evening and welcome to my dining room. This is Yeti. He's really the star of this show. He'll be giving your talk this evening. Recognize many of your faces from previous discussions. Happy to talk a little bit about the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which I have been the lead for the state on since summer of 2017, roughly. The Transportation and Climate Initiative is a long-standing regional collaboration that was launched in 2010 to try to tackle emissions from the transportation sector, greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. It built from a successful conversation that launched the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI, which is the cap and invest program for the power production sector. Since that time, as we got into the detailed conversation around transportation, we realized it was significantly more complicated in terms of the way in which energy is produced and used, and the number of users relative to the generators in the electricity space, and just trying to understand that landscape. When we started, when we finished RGGI, we had the environmental people and the energy people from each state. We needed to add the transportation folks from each of the states to be able to figure it out. So since 2010, the group has expanded to include every state from Maine down the eastern seaboard to Virginia, including our favorite jurisdiction, the District of Columbia. We call ourselves the jurisdictions because DC gets offended when we do not include them. So we do not call ourselves the states. We have, I'll go into a little bit about what a cap and invest program is, but it's useful to have a little bit of history. When the sort of foundation of environmental programs in this country, as many of you know, were built on very clear, explicit, what we sort of know as command and control environmental programs. Typical programs where I issue you a permit that says you have to reduce your emissions by such and such a percentage over a certain period of time. You have to do it in order to abide by the terms of the permit. That's it. Beginning in a little bit with the work to get lead out of gasoline, and then most notably in this country in dealing with acid rain, we introduced a program called a cap and trade program, where we capped the overall universe of emitters and had their emissions decline over time. But we allowed those emitters to work with themselves in a marketplace to find the most cost-effective emissions reductions. And that worked well for for pollutants that are of a regional or national scale, like the precursor chemicals that were causing acid rain. And so what ended up happening was a program was created whereby everybody's sort of initial kind of pre-existing historic emissions were capped at that level, and then that cap was declined over time. And each one of those entities were issued allowances, or essentially this is how much you can emit just like they would with the permit, but instead of being bound to that number, they could buy and sell from other coal-fired power plants. What it created was something like a 43% reduction in emissions over a 12-year period in the acid rain precursor chemicals. The issue was that at the same time, we didn't hold the demand for electric power constant or even have it decline. So power increased 26% during that time where we still saw a 43% reduction. So the question is, how can you both impact the cleanliness of the supply side while also decreasing demand? And that's where a cap and invest program comes in. Instead of issuing the allowances to the polluting entity, we instead make them purchase them in an auction format. And the proceeds from those auctions go to the states to be able to invest in programs that reduce demand for electricity generally, or help produce greener electricity. In Vermont, ironically, we have not used those resources in that way, in part because we already had Efficiency Vermont doing that work. Our resources from RGGI, which have been about on the range of about $2 million a year, have gone towards augmenting the forward capacity market funds, which fund our energy efficiency utilities. So primarily Efficiency Vermont, but some at BED and Vermont Gas to do weatherization efforts. So that's where the funds for your average Vermonter getting a rebate to do weatherization projects come from. So that's the sort of the nature of that. But in other states who didn't have efficiency programs, there was significant effort to decrease the demand for electricity so that we had to do less overall work to get the same amount of emissions reductions, right? So we could get, if we were using less electricity, the supply didn't need to be as clean. Ideally, as we're getting it to be more clean, we want it to be, but it didn't need to be in order to get the targeted emissions reductions we're going for. So that's where RGGI left off. The reason why RGGI has been, there was a lot of consternation about RGGI at the beginning. There was concern about how much it was going to cost. For doing that, at the beginning of the RGGI program, for the first 5 years, actually, the program was, the emission level was capped, and it was held flat until 2014, when we realized that the emissions from the power sector were way below, that we had overestimated what the emissions were going to be. And that because the cap was in place, there was a motivation for the electric generators to make investments in cleaner technology. And so we significantly ratcheted down the cap and have since gotten over 40% emissions reductions since the program in 2009. It's pretty significant. At the same time, the RGGI program has not added a significant burden to ratepayers. There has been some rate impact, but that's been offset in the overall energy usage, which has largely gone down at the same time. So overall, people are spending less on their cumulative electricity rather than on just their rates going up. And so that's where the TCI conversation started. As I said, we got into the conversation, realized it was a lot more complicated. Unlike an electric power generator, where there is a large power plant that is producing electricity typically, that you and I are all the generators of emissions from the transportation sector. As we move about in our vehicles, maybe some of you drive electric vehicles and are not emitting as much, but there's obviously some emissions from lifetime emissions from your work. But as we're all driving around in our internal combustion engine vehicles, we are the users of that energy and the generator of emissions. it's not possible to, from a sort of efficiency and program effectiveness standpoint, to put the point of regulation, essentially who needs to own these allowances, to put those at the level of your average consumer and vehicle owner. We would spend more time enforcing and trying to collect on these things than we would actually getting revenue. It just wouldn't make sense. So we did some analysis during these intervening years to look at where the sort of best point of regulation would be. We looked at doing it at the refinery level, which is sort of, or even at the extraction level. There are not significant extraction or refineries in most of the region. There are some, but there's a lot of the refined fuel is coming from out of the region. And so from an effectiveness standpoint, it would make more sense to regulate as much as possible entities that were in the region. So the sweet spot that was developed is essentially this sort of middle ground of wholesalers or the terminal operators, the sort of big fuel facilities who are selling fuel into markets like Vermont from Albany or from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, or Montreal or Portland, Maine, and the like. That gets to most of the fuel in the region. There's also some fuel that comes in from outside of the region, whether that be from, across the Ohio-Pennsylvania border or the Quebec Vermont border. And so we're making an effort to try to regulate all the fuel that's coming in and how exactly that functions. So that's the sort of background on kind of where we are now. How we got to this moment in time is in 2017 and 2018, the jurisdictions did a series of regional listening sessions to look at what stakeholders in the public wanted in terms of a regional transportation program. So after doing that, we got together and talked and reviewed what was said. And December of 2018, 9 states plus the District of Columbia put out a statement that said we would spend the next year developing a policy proposal to develop a cap and trade program, cap and invest program for transportation emissions. In the other 3 states that are participating in TCI but did not sign on were New York, New Hampshire, and Maine. New York, New Hampshire, and Maine have all been participating in the conversation, at least up until December of this year, when we issued the draft memorandum of understanding, which is the sort of guiding document for our agreement. At that point, Governor Sununu of New Hampshire decided to pull out of the process, but all of the other states have been there and been part of the policy development process. So we are in the process now of all of the states have been soliciting public input throughout the winter and early spring. We held several public meetings around the state and have looked to you all to find out what the interests are. We proposed a series of cap and stringencies and trajectories. And so what that means effectively is sort of what is the starting point of the cap and how does it decline over time? And that defines the percentage or the amount of emissions reductions we get overall. Like any or agreement between many different political entities with different competing interests, the agreement is something of a what everybody can agree to. It's not perfect, but what we saw in Reggie is that we needed some lived experience of the cap before we knew what we were really capable of getting out of the system. And so when you think about Reggie started out flat, as I mentioned, for the first 5 years, and then significantly ratcheted down. And that's a model that could potentially be followed with TCI to better understand what the market is, how the market's going to respond. Everybody thought we were going to break the power market with Reggie. Turns out we didn't. And so there needs to be a little bit of that sort of same level of trust built through the TCI process. So that's all pre-COVID, right? So that's kind of where we stood. We were going to come out in the spring, sort of vague spring timeframe, with an agreement, and those states that had chosen to move forward would sign on, and we'd go from there. Unfortunately, COVID happened, and rightfully, all of our leadership is focusing on the immediate crisis in front of us. And so the just from an obvious standpoint, the bandwidth to deal with significant policy work that's outside of that sort of laser-like focus is a challenge right now. It's a challenge for everybody. I have not been able to spend as much time working on TCI as I would like as we work to nail down some of the details. But the conversations amongst staff, amongst folks at my level are still continuing, but I think we all recognize the moment that we're in. We have not announced officially that there's going to be any form of delay, but I think it's reasonable given the conversations we all need to have with leadership, both and as the administration, and to continue the conversations that we've already begun in both bodies of the legislature. There's lots more discussion to have happen that is not particularly well suited for this moment. So I'm not going to sort of conjecture one way or another whether or not there will be a delay, but I think that, sort of the obvious suggestion is that we all need the time to get through this so that we can focus on the policy at hand. And with that, Rob, that's a good overview, and then I'm happy to let Mark go and then answer questions now, and whatever works best for you.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Commissioner Peter Walk. Thanks for the brief intro. I am actually just going to do a quick little poll because I want to just know kind of what the level of understanding people have of the Transportation Climate Initiative, because a lot of us in the policy world think everybody knows what we're talking about, and I just want to kind of gauge this. So it's just an informal poll that will come up through the Zoom. It's anonymous, so it doesn't tell me who did it, but just I'm going to launch it right now. And if you tell me that, if it comes up on your screen, please just put it into there and let me know what it is. And while it's following up on this, I will share it in the chat box, the results, but Steve Crowley from the Sierra Club Executive Committee is going to just introduce Mark Kreswick quickly.
Hi, thanks, Rob. So thank you, Commissioner Walk. That was a great intro. Mark Kreswick, as Rob said, he's the Eastern Deputy Director for the Beyond Coal campaign for the Sierra Club. I just heard before we got online here that he's been doing this for 14 years and has some good experience. And I can say, because I do some work with National Sierra Club on policy issues with energy, that almost every call I'm on, somebody comes up to a stumbling block and they say, oh, Kreswick knows the answer to that. So he's something of a legend in the Sierra Club. He's been, in addition to his responsibilities with Beyond Coal, he's also been part of the lead team on TCI for the Sierra Club. And so, Mark, before I get you to fill us in on, where the Sierra Club stands on this and what we hope to get out of TCI, I wonder a couple of things. One, could you give us a little background on Beyond Coal? And I just heard there was some good news from Georgia today. Maybe you could mention that. And the other thing is, what is your team like? How does the Sierra Club engage on TCI? And then maybe you could fill us in on where the Sierra Club stands before we get to questions from the whole group.
For sure. Happy to answer some of those initial questions first, Stephen. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. And thank you to Peter for your leadership and Vermont's support for moving forward with a strong and just policy to limit climate pollution from motor fuels throughout the region. We do hope as we get past this crisis in our communities and are able to recover that the jurisdictions, as a DC resident, I will very much say jurisdictions, though sometimes we like to think of ourselves as a state, that TCI and the opportunity here is viewed as a way to put people back to work, which is desperately needed coming out of this crisis. And that's really what the data shows, that a policy like the Transportation and Climate Initiative that would limit climate pollution and invest revenues raised by limiting climate pollution from motor fuels into clean transportation opportunities, particularly for those communities that have been most overburdened by transportation pollution and underserved by our current clean transportation opportunities, will create jobs, will grow the economy in the region, and will save lives, in addition to limiting climate pollution. One of the most important things about the transportation and climate policy is it's very apparent. I mean, almost every state and jurisdiction that is part of the discussion has a climate goal through 2030 and through 2050 that the states have committed to reducing climate pollution, including Vermont. It is simply impossible for any jurisdiction that has committed to limit climate pollution at the scale that these jurisdictions have to do so without limiting climate pollution from motor fuels, without electrifying the transportation sector, both personal vehicles and public transportation, and creating new opportunities, again, for those who have been most overburdened and underserved, to access the benefits, the many benefits, jobs, economic growth, and lives saved, reduce congestion, shorter commutes, safer commutes, easier communities for walking and biking, all of those benefits that people need to have access to. We simply can't do it, again, without electrifying transportation and investing in clean, safe transportation opportunities. Given that the federal government under the Trump administration has now moved in the last few weeks under the cover of the crisis that we are in to revoke the clean car standards federally and to revoke California's authority to set more ambitious standards for our vehicles, and all of the states that participate, including Vermont, in that program. There simply is no way, again, to meet Vermont's climate goals without a policy like the Transportation and Climate Initiative that creates revenue, that limits climate pollution from motor fuels, and invests it in these clean transportation opportunities. So it's vital from the Sierra Club's perspective that Vermont and all of the jurisdictions that have been participating in discussions continue to move forward and ultimately implement such a policy. Just to give you a sense of perspective of what that means, right now, I know Vermont had committed to supporting rebates and incentives for electric vehicles up to about $1.1 million. For perspective, the Transportation and Climate Initiative, at least at the way the states, the jurisdictions have modeled such a policy, would deliver about $60 million in annual revenue to the state of Vermont, more than 30 times what the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative brings in from the power sector. So that level of revenue is critical to and an incredible opportunity for Vermont to invest in the kind of clean transportation opportunities that are necessary in order to meet the overall climate goals and deliver all of those benefits that I was talking about. Those benefits I'm talking about in terms of jobs created, economic growth, health benefits, lives saved, all come from the jurisdiction's own modeling of what this policy does. So it's critical. This is a vital opportunity to move forward right now. The Sierra Club has been involved for many years, dating back to the beginning of discussions about a regional policy like this through the Transportation and Climate Initiative. So we support, thanks to our supporters like you all, staff in all of the jurisdictions that are participating with a particular eye to the Mid-Atlantic, where we are actually the leads for the regional advocates in places like Maryland, Delaware, and DC. So there are staff and lead volunteers throughout the region of for the Sierra Club that are actively participating in discussions with other partners. More than 100 organizations throughout the region have expressed their support for such a policy and continue to engage regularly, as well as supporting our staff and volunteers and communicating with state officials who are engaging, like Peter, in this conversation. So we, as part of the Clean Transportation for All campaign of the Sierra Club, we support that work throughout the region, again, with a particular eye to the Mid-Atlantic, where we are the leads for the regional advocates. Steve, were there any other questions I didn't touch on?
I think we're probably ready to go with questions from our audience here. That's great. Thanks, Mark. It's great to hear a full picture on that.
Absolutely.
So folks who are out there online, it looks like we've got 32 people on this call, which is terrific. If anybody wants to ask a question, I think the best way to facilitate that is for you to type that into the chat box. And if you can't find the chat box, scroll your cursor across the bottom of the Zoom screen, and you'll see a toolbar pop up at the bottom, and right in the middle, you'll see chat. If you click on that, you'll see a white bar on the right-hand side of the screen, and at the bottom of that, you should be able to type in, at least say you have a question if you don't want to type in your whole question, and we'll get around to you. But first, I think Jack Cushman on our team may have a question or two that he's ready to go with.
Sure, thank you. And I'm glad to see so many people here. I'm try to keep my questions short because I'm sure there are lots of others. Peter, you mentioned the precedent of RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, for this program. And of course, it is a model program, and we've had long experience with it. I'm interested that the RGGI program was started in 2005, I think, right before the last great economic turmoil. And there was a lot of concern at the time that the disruption of putting pollution fees on polluters would cause economic disruption. I think as it turned out, RGGI raised a lot of revenues for the states. It caused no economic harm in the region. And the state leadership was all very happy to have that program in place. I wonder now that we're in a time of economic turmoil again, do you see a parallel? Do you think we could bring this new revenue source on stream regionally without causing economic disruption at an awkward time?
So, Jack, thanks for your question. I think I would clarify that I don't see this as a revenue stream. The revenue stream and the cap play with each other to create the most efficient emissions reductions. Frankly, if we didn't have to produce any revenue and got the emissions reductions, that would be okay with me, but that's not going to happen. So it's the balance between the two. It's finding that right level of restriction in the cap that's creating the revenue that's being invested in programs that's then circling back into driving down emissions that creates that effective model. Sorry, I went off video. And so it's that balancing point between the supply and the demand side that really works. At the same time, so it was moving forward in 2005. It didn't actually, the first auction didn't go into effect until 2009. But by that point, all of the work to implement it was going on. And so it was sort of already on that path rather than at the moment where none of the states have officially agreed that they're going to do it yet. So it's a slightly different moment in time in terms of how do we deal with this information. I think the other piece that we're all kind of trying to grapple with is we have no idea what this economic downturn looks like. It's this strange combination of already plummeting gas prices combined with no demand, and in some ways the low gas prices would seem like the ideal time to institute something that might impact the cost of gasoline, right? Because you're creating a relatively low consequence on the price of gas. At the same time, as we talk about, as Mark talks about, rightly, the sort of just process of bringing everybody along to cleaner transportation options, the purchasing power of our lowest income Vermonters is at its low, one of its lowest points ever, with 70,000 people applying for unemployment insurance. And so I don't know yet from a sort of a basic math point whether or not whether the decline in the price of gasoline is offset by the challenges associated with, with sort of the overall economic buying power of your average Vermont family. My guess is we're still at a point where the relative cost of fuel for those Vermonters is higher than it was at the beginning of this process.
Thank you. That's very helpful. As you see all of this economic volatility, that must play a little bit of havoc with your modeling. But is it not also the case that this program isn't about, nobody's about to pull the trigger on this program? It's still very much in the design phase to make sure.
Yeah, so even if, I mean, so we would have enough of the details to be able to, if we were an absolute dictatorship, be able to move forward shortly. But the reality is, in order to implement all these programs, most states need legislative authority. So I'll be going to talk to Sarah and Molly and Kurt and others on this call to talk about whether or not how we move forward with it. And then we would need to go through a rulemaking process, and other state would, because the way it functions as however many other states are involved, each individual state has their own program that shares certain attributes. Otherwise, we get in trouble for being interstate compacts that don't have congressional authority, and that causes other problems. So yeah, hope that answers your question.
Great.
Yeah, this is Mark.
Do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, just to add a couple other things on this. Again, I want to emphasize the jurisdiction's own modeling demonstrates that this policy would grow the economy and it put more money into people's pockets, which is, again, a critical thing that we need to be doing right now, coming out of the crisis that we're in. The simple reason for that is most of our fuel dollars are exported out of the region. Right. So in the Northeast here, we essentially ship our energy dollars outside of the region. The other side of this is that this policy is overwhelmingly popular in Vermont and throughout the rest of the region. In every state, overwhelming and bipartisan majorities support this type of policy. And this policy specifically. So this is kind of I would say a no-brainer in many ways from an economic and a political perspective to move forward with.
Great, thanks. So again, folks, if anybody has questions, just at least mention it in the chat and we'll get to you. And I see that Eric has a question to ask. Eric, you are on mute. Can we?
There you go.
Hi. What is the difference between this and what British Columbia has been doing with a carbon pollution tax, where we know that has been working? And why isn't Vermont showing a lower emissions over the years if this thing works? Eric Friedman, was it Eric Friedman? Or Thomas Friedman. I don't know if you read the New York Times, but Thomas Friedman had an interesting article in the New York Times today about this same problem. And it's, of course, transportation section as number one, and probably home heating as number two. And he talked about electric cars and how part of the problem with electric cars, which solves the problem completely, if people would slowly get over to electric cars and to use that, still have the transportation available, which we all want. But with electric cars, we have a problem of range anxiety. And he talked about that at great length, and why we don't have enough places to charge electric cars. And I think that is a much better solution than, coupled with a carbon pollution tax, which doesn't seem to want to go over with our legislatures, but legislators don't want to go along with anything because they think that they hurt their electorate. And so that's my question. Why don't we go with a system that works, that we know works? And we know that the auto industry is dying to get over to electric cars in the first place. That's why they're starting to do their retooling already. Anyway, that's my comment or question.
So Eric, thanks for your question. I think what you've described is the generation of revenue that's been invested in programs that help reduce emissions. That is effectively what a cap and invest program does. What it does is rather than control the price, it controls the emissions reductions, and the price is taken care of in the market. So if we don't need as much revenue, the price of a ton of carbon in the market will be lower. If we need more revenue because we're not getting the emissions reductions, then the price will be higher. And so we as government, which are always slow to react and change things, don't have to be involved in that process. And you asked the question about whether or not RGGI is working. It's not working for the transportation sector yet because we're not using it for the transportation sector. All of our growth in emissions is in the transportation sector. If you look, I'm trying to pull up right now our table for our emissions inventory, which, give me 1 second, which shows our projections into 2017 and 2018, because our most recent data is really only from 2016 solidly. But 2018 is effectively we're reduced 80% of our emissions from the electricity sector in 2018 from 1990 levels. 80%. That's not all due to RGGI, but RGGI establishes that clear overarching framework that other policies help to build on, the renewable energy standard, all the other work that goes into driving change. But it's working in the power sector. So I do want to take one, slight quibble with that it is actually working and in conjunction with other policies. And there isn't a question that TCI by itself is going to be the answer in the transportation sector. We're going to need more to get there, but it is a great framework that is supportive of all the other policies we could put in place.
Absolutely, Peter. And Eric, we could completely agree. There isn't only one policy in the electric sector. RGGI is joined by clean energy standards and many other different policies, energy efficiency investments. The same thing is needed in the transportation sector, where TCI is one policy that can help and create a revenue stream that can be invested both in electric vehicles, but also in electric vehicle charging infrastructures. There's also to overcome the range anxiety you cite. And we completely agree, right? As the policies that we have helped put in place in the electric sector have succeeded, transportation and buildings are the places where we need a lot more investment, where we need new policies to move rapidly to electrification of both buildings and transportation. And this is just one policy that can get us there, particularly in the face, again, as I said, of the most important policy at the federal level, the clean car standards, being rolled back by the Trump administration. This is the best opportunity to have a big impact for states to be able to move forward in the face of what the Trump administration is doing.
I think that we have to look at what is really happening out there. People are not buying electric cars as they have to make this whole thing work. And unless we go to, like, just an example, Sugarbush, where I live near, is a big ski industry that gets people from all over and driving non-electric cars for the most part. They started out 3 years ago with 2 charging stations at Sugarbush. Now they're up to 25 charging stations. They're getting people to come here with electric vehicles. There has to be the incentive if the federal government won't do it, maybe the state governments will have to do it. But
right. So Eric, that's what we're doing. And that's what we're trying to do more of. TCI can provide revenue in order to help provide more incentive for Vermonters into electric vehicles. And so the revenue that's generated from TCI can be invested in a number of different things, whether it be for electric vehicles or public transit or bike ped infrastructure, any number of things. And frankly, it could be invested in anything the states want to, because it is not a sort of regional determination of where that money goes.
So actually, I want to pass it over to Chairman Kurt McCormick. He's the House Transportation Committee Chair. He raised his hand up a while ago, and he had something he wanted to add to the conversation. Representative McCormick.
Yeah, thank you. No, I lowered my hand.
Oh, well, I raised it up. Okay, just wanted to make sure we have you participating, and actually I hope to have him as a guest on a couple of weeks. He hasn't responded to my invite yet, but we may have him onto it. And actually, while I have the microphone on, Gina Campoli has a question. And Gina, if you want to mute yourself to ask your question.
Peter said that Reggie caused the price of energy to go up, but consumer demand has gone down, causing overall consumer savings. And I wondered if we know that's going to be true for TCI, or can we predict that as a possibility?
Yeah, so
that's an essential factor in selling this.
Yeah, so as Mark was suggesting, our current analysis that I'm going to put a big asterisk next to, and let me come back to it, suggests that the overall economic impact will be ever so slightly positive over the course of a 10-year period. It starts out at a bit of a negative where people haven't made the capital purchases necessary to take advantage of the economic savings, and then quickly it crosses the line and becomes positive. But I want to be very clear that it's not a particularly strong positive or negative influence on the economy. It's really a marginal cost, because at the lowest end of the sort of most modest cap reduction, you're really talking about a 5 cent per gallon impact on a gallon of gas. For most Vermont families, that's $50 a year. So the impact is not significant one way or another. So the reason why I put a big asterisk next to that modeling is because we have, the world is a lot different than we started this modeling process.
Right.
We modeled essentially a price of gasoline in 2022 that was about $3 a gallon, somewhere in there. I can't remember exactly, but online with where prices were headed. And we modeled the clean car standard, the sort of cafe standards not being rolled back. We also looked at, and that produced a business as usual reduction of 19% over the course of a 10-year period. Well, we also looked at what happens if, holy cow, what if gas is only $1.50? What happens? Or what happens if the clean car standards, or if the safe standard goes into place? Both of those things have happened in the last month.
Right.
And so what we saw in emissions reductions in those scenarios were only about a 6% reduction over time, and that is the building of fuel economy and people switching to EVs based on sort of the way the market is moving. But we need to supercharge that speed of where that's going, and that becomes harder when the price of fuel is low, because the price of fuel is the price of TCI is not significant enough to change overall capital buying behavior, because the fuel is an operational cost. It's what you buy in terms of your vehicle that defines what type of energy you use. And when people are coming out of this recession, we know every time we come out of a recession, there is a push to purchase vehicles, American-made vehicles, right? As part of the way we buy ourselves out of our recessions, we have to with a price of gasoline at $1.50, we could see a lot of the gains that we might make go away from people purchasing bigger vehicles and less fuel efficient vehicles. And so there's a real danger point right here. That's why I think if we can be thinking about not just about TCI, but how do we think about the sort of holistic, all of the monies that are going to be coming from the federal government, how do we invest that stimulus in like the EV for clunkers style programs and those things where we are actively transitioning people who couldn't normally afford to get a vehicle into something that is either more efficient or altogether electric.
Yeah, Peter's exactly right. This is, we're going to see more money flowing from the federal government down to the states across the economy, including in energy assistance and all kinds of different areas where it's vitally important that we as advocates are engaged, both in putting people back to work and making sure those dollars are flowing to those purposes, but also making sure we're not locking in increased emissions because money is flowing either to, as Peter is describing, more inefficient and gas vehicles, but also gas in buildings and gas appliances, right? We need to be making sure both at the federal and the state level as that money is flowing, that it's all going to electrification as much as possible. Otherwise, we're just locking ourselves into 10, 15, 20 years worth of emissions. The other thing I want to, just in direct response to your question, Gina, is the history of climate pollution reductions in the Northeast have demonstrated across the board that they're good for the economy, that they create jobs in addition to reducing pollution and saving people's lives. And that's because, again, we are not extractive economies. Instead of every time we invest in reducing climate pollution, in electrification, in our communities, instead of shipping those dollars out of the region, we're putting those dollars back to work in our communities. It's always going to be beneficial for the economy and for people. Reducing climate pollution is good for the economies in our region.
Sounds like we're really going to be at a standstill on this for a while. I mean, there's the issue that Peter described of the policymakers having so much on their plates. There's the economics of not knowing what's going on in 6 months, and then there's the stimulus and how that's going to play out. So I think it'd be pretty impossible to do much on this, at least 3 months down the road.
I think you're probably right, Gina. I would say that there are at the same time, there are also some hopeful signs coming out of this. Air quality generally is the cleanest it's been in years, and obviously that's largely because we're not driving our vehicles around. In India, you can actually see the Himalayas from down in the foothills for the first time in decades, right? There are all sorts of things that could come of this if we can capture some of these moments. We can't, and I don't think that everybody wants to just go back to business as usual. That there are parts of this that are actually from a sort of a slowing down and thinking about what's important to us. There's lots of things that are valuable to this moment that we can capture and work with. Obviously you're seeing a major need for an investment in broadband in Vermont, but I think there's an opportunity. My staff suggests every day that they'd like to expand the amount that they telework, and we've gotten sort of past the point of making people prove that they can do it. Because guess what? We're all doing it. This is where I spend 12 hours of my day hanging out with Yeti and my kids in the background when you And you know, that's what we do. So there are some moments, there are some things that we can capture from this. Not all of them are replicable in a normally functioning economy, but I don't know if we're going to have a normally functioning economy for a while either.
I might add to Gina, as advocates, one of the points that we might make as citizens here is that now's not the time to be walking away from a program like this. It's our governor who needs to decide that he wants to stay in this process. The program is still being designed, but let's not walk away from it at a time like this. And the second point that I think resonates, as long as we've got so many legislators in the room, is that we don't always have to be caught flat-footed by crisis. And there's an ample literature that tells us that investment in resilience pays back many-fold the amount of money that's put into resilience programs. It's always the case that investments in making a stronger community pay back 4, 5, 6 times the amount of money that you put into them. So I find that to be an effective message for those who are looking around for what to say in the next part of our campaigns.
I just want to note we're getting closer towards the end, so only a couple time for a couple more questions. So any last minute questions, please ask.
I have a question, Rob, on my end, if that's okay.
Right, Jordan.
Hey there, everybody. So I'm functioning as a Sierra Club member at this time. We've talked a lot about how this decision comes down to the governor and a lot of the messaging that we should be carrying forward. But I think as advocates, as citizens, as voters, how do we apply that knowledge? How do we express that knowledge, especially in, this sort of new and unique time that we're in? What are the advocacy avenues that we can take?
I'll let Mark speak to that because I love to quietly go about the hard business of running government. And so Mark's the advocate in the room.
I like to go about the quiet business of advocacy. No, just kidding. Thank you, Jordan, for the question. I think the greatest opportunity in the short term really is in engaging initially on how stimulus dollars are going to be spent in the states. That really is a scale of money that we haven't seen, and it will likely be even greater than what we saw during the ARA days more than 10 years ago, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And we will probably never see this level of investment again. So that's really priority number one right now, is putting people back to work and making sure those dollars are spent well. After that, I think really specifying and working together with other folks in Vermont to figure out where would you want the money being spent from TCI, and getting very specific about the projects, the investments like electrification, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, as Eric was asking about earlier, and demonstrating to officials. Peter already knows it, but certainly his boss and legislators on this call, that exactly the kind of projects, the benefits that you want to see in such a policy. The legislature has the opportunity to move forward and say, hey, we're in to this policy. Governor has an opportunity to publicly say, hey, I'm in for this policy as soon as we can all move forward together. So that's absolutely some of the priorities I would say.
Thanks, both.
And I will just add one thing is, for any of you with New York connections right there on the border, Governor Cuomo, maybe not the best time to contact him about it, but Governor Cuomo needs some pressure to move forward. I think Peter can speak to him, or may not be willing to speak to some of the dynamics between the states. But New York's pretty critical here, and they haven't been since first kind of starting these conversations, frankly, a number of years ago. Governor Cuomo hasn't been the kind of leader we need to see on this. So I will say, Governor Baker in Massachusetts has been doing a good job. So there's other leaders, particularly, again, any connections in New York. He needs to lead on this for this to work. I don't know if Peter wants to say anything, but he'll probably be politic.
So we abide by the Chatham House rule in all TCI discussions, or for those who don't know that what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. I can talk about what we're working on, what we're thinking about. I'm not going to speculate around other states. Having worked in New York, I could give you lots of speculation, but I'm not going to.
So we have time for one more question. If somebody's got a burning question, jump right in. Otherwise, Rob, how do you want to wrap this up? I think we're ready to go.
Can I make a question?
Yes, please.
One of the problems with encouraging electric cars and things like that, it would seem to me that this is an obvious time to do what was mentioned here earlier, to reduce the actual amount of transportation for a lot of people. A lot of people could be doing things in their home and not using electric cars or anything, because electric cars use a lot of materials and so forth to be made. So the fewer cars there are actually doing unnecessary trips that don't need to be done, the better, electric or otherwise. Does anyone have a comment on that?
Yeah, Joan, this is Mark. You're absolutely right. And I would say, but at the same time, there are, particularly in a rural state like Vermont, folks who are going to have to drive. And so electric vehicles are critical for that segment of the population, but we should absolutely be investing in the kind of things that enable people not to have to take trips. I think if one thing that has become clear from this crisis is telecommuting. More people can be doing telecommuting, working. As Peter highlighted, they need broadband access. We need to be investing in that, but telecommuting is one of the best ways to reduce the number of trips in vehicles. So you're exactly right. Those are all things we can invest in in addition, but again, in a state like Vermont, you're going to need to electrify vehicles as well. Peter?
I would echo that point as we think about, so part of this conversation is there's a balance between the revenue that's generated and what you spend it on, and you can spend it on lots of things, but if you don't spend it on things that are actually reducing emissions, then you can drive up costs in the marketplace. That's that feedback loop. The most cost-effective emissions reductions in the short term might not be the most cost-effective emissions reductions in the long term, right? It may be a lot of money to get Vermont built out with enough broadband to really have people telecommute effectively. Yeah. And so therefore we might be driving more towards EV incentives and other things where we know we can get cost-effective reductions. We have to balance both of those things. And I think it also comes down to not just access, but it's also a land use question, right? So we have, the more we can incentivize compact village centers, the more we have the opportunity to have people not need to take trips in their vehicle. And that's not just having a cluster of houses, but having a cluster of houses supported by a small local store or a coffee shop or whatever it might be, so that people have that sense of community that keeps them there and living and working there. That's an incredibly important piece. Some of the things that we hear most from communities around the state as the water, when wastewater person, sort of entity in the state, is that there are lots of communities that would love to be able to have enough density in their village center, but they lack the ability to have an effective wastewater treatment system because they have old septic systems that need to be replaced, but not quite enough users to get to some sort of wastewater system. And it holds them back from having the density necessary to support housing, to support small enterprises, to support any number of things that could make their little community viable. And so that could be a potential investment to think about, how do you seed that process? It's not actually about the money, it's about somebody to hold the community's hand through the process and help access various pots of money along the way. So there's lots of things that we could do with this money that could have huge long-term impacts on the greenhouse gas emissions that might not be directly, immediately relatable to transportation emissions right now, but will in that sort of 2050 scope timeframe. So while we push to put on the accelerator, we need to also not be thinking about the sort of the near term or only sort of approach.
Okay, quick, before I close this out, I know Chairman McCormick raised his hand again. I'm going to give him the opportunity, even though last time he said he didn't want to say something, and I put him on the spot if he's going to join us again for a conversation about public transit in a couple of weeks. He should see his email. But Chairman McCormick, do you want to say something quickly before I close this conversation? Here.
Rob, could I just say something about electric?
No, Eric, we're closing this up, so I'm letting Chairman McCormick say something.
Muted myself. I want to thank Joan Sachs very much for that comment. She's absolutely right, and agree with everything else that's been said, except for Mark. When we keep saying Vermont's rural, therefore, we kind of hide. We won't hide, but we rest on that point. And then that's why we don't do anything about all the single occupancy vehicles we have. Chittenden County is turning into, it's a small American city. We have traffic here on the interstate through the city that's reminiscent of Queens, New York. It's just 2 lanes instead of 3. More than 70% of those cars, at least in the peak hours, have 1 person in them, 70%. So there's much that can be done, but we really need to stop talking about how it was too rural, therefore we can't do this, we can't do that, can't have good transit. We can. And so I want to thank Joan very much for that comment. She's absolutely right.
Okay, thank you very much, Chairman McCormick, for that final comments. I just want to show this one little thing. Just everybody asked what you can do next. I just want to remind people that you can contact the governor. It's very important for him to hear what your thoughts are on things like this. And as a lot of people are spending a lot of time at home now, you can actually write a physical handwritten letter. That would actually attract the people's attention. So there's the address. You can call them, or you can add from that link to the governor's email address. And then also you can contact your individual legislators on that. And then also just for the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources has a very good page about TCI, so you can follow up with any information you haven't heard from here tonight. And it has my email address there, and Steve Crowley from the Sierra Club. And then also just wanted to give you the upcoming conversations that we're going to be doing Wednesday at 7 p.m. We're doing an Earth Day with a couple teachers and Vermont Energy Education Partnerships next Wednesday. Then we're doing a discussion with some of the labor folks. Larry Williams Jr. of the Sierra Club Labor Program will be presenting with us, with a Vermont AFL-CIO president and a couple other people. The Energy Action Network. Then the future of public transit in Vermont. Jen Wood, Green Mountain Transit, and is definitely confirmed on this. And then also some folks from the from Vermont Law School working on environmental justice will be talking on May 20th. So we'll be regularly doing these at 7 o'clock on Wednesdays.